So Dr. Matt Winning is first up, and he works as an environmental economist at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. He holds a PhD in climate change policy, and Matt has come with some pretty terrifying statistics, but thankfully his energy and his quick humour will deliver this in a way that it'll be very thought-provoking, I'm sure. So as always, I advocate veiling a lot of truth in humour. I'm sure that's what you'll do. So can we please give Matt a very warm SPA welcome?
Pleasure. So basically when I introduce myself to people, what they hear is, you're a funny climate scientist, which is confusing at best, right? It's a bit like telling someone that, finding out someone is an estate agent, right? And also a really nice person. Yeah, bit of a shock to the system, isn't it? So I do that. That is what I do. I basically go about and I talk about climate change. So I work university 4 days a week, and then I go and speak and do other stuff in the evenings and other days. So it's great to be here, and we'll get into a bit. Oh, actually, before I get onto that, so what should I say? I have a PhD in climate change policy. So I like to tell people I'm the sort of doctor that if you do have a heart attack on a flight, I will rush to your side, but only to berate you for flying. And I work at one of the world's leading research institutes on sustainability and climate change, or as my dad likes to say, Matthew's 37 and he's still at university. So that's always a joy. That's what I do, but I don't know if you saw the next slide. So I do this across the country, and the next slide is genuinely something that I do everywhere I go. I like to say, I'm an environmental economist, I'm a researcher, but I'm also a comedian. But just so you've got an idea of where I am in the UK comedy ladder, I'm the sort of comedian that's followed on Twitter by the European corrugated board industry. Yes. Yeah, and the worst thing about it, more followers than me. And when I found that out, I wanted to walk directly into the sea, which will become increasingly easy over the coming decades. And that's the first climate change joke there. I don't know if you spotted it. Genuinely, so I genuinely do this around the country, and I always use the European corrugated board industry. And, most people go, great, imagine being followed on Twitter by the European corrugated board industry. Most people in here are like, so what? We get it. It's FEFCO. Yeah, good stuff. Not followed by, the UK Sheep Plant Association. Couldn't use that. But don't follow them back. So, who's the real winner in this instance? What should I say at this point in time? Well, basically what I should say is I'm going to cover these three questions, right? And these three questions are, I think, three important questions we as a society and as industries need to ask ourselves if we want to solve the climate crisis. They just also happen to be the same three questions that you will be asked at any job interview by a bureau de change. Must we change? Can we change? You get the idea? Okay, no worries. So that's what we're going to cover today. So we're going to go through each of these and a little bit of detail now. First of all, this is going to be sort of high-level stuff because you guys are getting into it a lot more in the afternoon. I see a gentleman there that's talking about extended producer responsibility. Oh, lots of fun stuff. So I'm going to keep this fairly high-level so that it's very much about what you're going to delve into a little bit more. So first of all, the planet's going to be absolutely fine, right? Everybody's worried about the planet. I'm not, right? The only reason that I'm interested in this and that have been working on this for the last 15 years is because predominantly climate change affects people, right? People across the world. And we have to remember that people are central to this, right? The planet will be all right. It's people, plants, and animals that are impacted. And if anything, plants, they're sort of doing their bit, right? They're actually putting a bit of effort in. Animals, haven't done an awful lot to cause climate change, apart from perhaps Peppa Pig, who has a very pro-fracking energy, if you ask me. Basically, I've got a 2-year-old. All of my references are children's cartoons. That's all I have now. But, what I'm saying is, I'm interested in this because of people. I don't consider myself an environmentalist as such. I don't think burning incense is a substitute to having a personality, right? It's about finding reasons to do this, and we have to remember that all the time. Now, a couple of stats. The hottest year on record is 2020, 2020. That is also my PIN number. Always change my PIN number to the warmest year on record. Does it make me more susceptible to fraud? Absolutely. Absolutely. But the message is getting out there. And that's the important thing, isn't it? I have to change it all the time. Now, what else should I say? Now, a couple of people occasionally pick up on stuff when I say that. So, in a couple of the global temperature records, there's 5 global temperature records that are kept that we know how things are changing. 2 of them had 2016 joint with 2020. So, a couple of people will say to me, Matt, was 2016 also a warm year? It was. It was a warm year. But the reason that 2016 was such a warm year was because it was an El Nino year. And if you aren't aware, El Nino are a 5-piece Italian a cappella band. I actually had tickets for them before COVID, never got to see them. No, it's a natural warming event, right, that occurs, and so 2016 was a very warm year. Anyway, 2024 is going to be an El Nino year, and it's definitely going to be the warmest year that all of us in this room will have ever experienced. Because that's what's going to happen. We sort of, it doesn't stop, this doesn't change, it doesn't go away. It's going to continue. And, if we look at the stats, the last 7 years have been the 7 warmest years ever recorded in human history. The last 3 decades have been the 3 warmest decades that have occurred. And it's, the trend is what we're looking for here. And what has caused most of that warming that we've seen at a global level? Well, it has been predominantly our burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, gas, and oil, which was the original name of the band Earth, Wind and Fire. Back when they were sponsored by... I won't even say. Right, but yeah, basically since the Second World War, our use of fossil fuels has been sort of exponential. And that's been, a number of things... consumption, population, other things like that have driven it. But it's been different across different places in the world. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but basically, we needed to predominantly, so about 85% is coming from our fossil fuel use, and that's what we need to tackle. So, how do we do that? Well, I'll go into that in a little bit. But first of all, I'd just like to say, what are the impacts? So I'm going to go into a bit more detail here on the impacts of climate change, so we've got a bit more info. So what are the impacts of climate change going to be? Well, I think we can all see from this chart that the planet is going to get squashed and just go sort of weird colours. Yeah, and there's going to be 6 of them, so you get to take your pick which one you live on. Changes in average surface temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, all the good stuff. So, heat waves. As the American rapper Nelly once said, it's getting hot in here, so relocate your homes. And I basically, things are getting hotter. Even in the UK last year, we saw 40 degrees for the first time. And you still have newspapers in the UK splashing things about how warm it is, even though the UK has never experienced heat waves like this. And it's difficult to, because I get it. People are like, well, it's sunny, right? But I don't know if anyone actually tried to go out in that heat. It was unbearable. And the reason that we care about that, again, is back to people. It's the same reason that we care about COVID and doing things about COVID is the same reason that we care about climate change, because it's protecting vulnerable people. It's protecting elderly people. It's protecting pregnant people, young people, others that have, underlying conditions predominantly are much more susceptible to things like heat waves. It makes it much worse. So the World Health Organization says that heat waves that last longer or are more intense are more likely to affect people that already have respiratory diseases, heart disease, kidney problems, that sort of thing. So, and if you aren't vulnerable, I'm sure most people in this room aren't, but if you aren't, the other thing that you will have experienced already with heat waves is that things don't cool down enough. Especially at night time, we don't get enough sleep, which often leads to a lot more passive aggression between couples. And that's not from the WHO, that's from my own research. So, what are we going to do about this? Well, not what we're going to do about it. What are the other impacts of that going to be? So heat waves cause droughts. And droughts were already expected in England to run short of water in the next 25 years, and the Environment Agency chief has called for water use to be cut by roughly about a third. And specifically, Sir James Bevan has asked that he wants to see wasting water become as socially unacceptable as blowing smoke in the face of a baby. Two things. One, oddly specific. And two, I live in England, right? Obviously, I'm Scottish. You can tell from my accent, but I live in England. My wife's English. My son's English. Most of my friends are English. I know English people, and I know what they're going to do. They're just going to try and make it more socially acceptable to blow smoke in the face of a baby. They can just do what they like, right? I'm joking. But, I'm just saying these are all impacts that we experience already. And again, we think about that not as maybe, what does that matter? I can't, water my garden as much or whatever it is, these problems. But already global food production is being impacted by that. About half of food produced worldwide is produced in small-scale farms, outdoors, in places that are probably going to be impacted quite severely by climate change. A lot of workers will either not be able to work in those conditions or work in those conditions and get kidney problems and crop failures, that sort of stuff. And again, we think of this as happening far away. It's not an issue for us, potentially, in the United Kingdom, but it is. It's already impacted us. Now, I don't know if you remember two recent heat waves, one in 2018. There was about a 3-week period where, especially in the south of the country, there was no rain for about 3 weeks. And because of that, I don't know if you're aware of this, because of that, chips in the United Kingdom shrank by an inch the following year, right? And because of the heat wave we just had this summer, the British Potato Trade Association say the price of chips is going up. And that is not a world I want to live in. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, you can't dip small chips. Right? The condiment industry's gone. And one of the only joys that I have left in my life, I've got a small child, I don't get out much, right? All I do is I go to the chip shop, I get a bag of chips, and sometimes, on a magical occasion, I'll find a really big chip inside it. Yeah! And I'll pull it out and I'll hold it aloft, as if I've just found the sword in the stone, and I'll go, "Look, honey, look at the size of that chip!" And my wife always goes, "It must have eaten all the other chips." Yes! Your children won't have that. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, we're fighting for big chips. What I'm saying is there are difficult choices that need to be made in climate change. You can either have big chips, or you can stop flying to Magaluf to sleep with someone from Middlesbrough, when you could just go to Middlesbrough and do it. The solutions are there, people, if you look hard enough. Okay, is that too early in the afternoon for that? I don't know. It's good. Glad to hear someone's on board with it. So that's Glasgow, by the way. Genuinely a place called Glasgow, Montana, in the United States, which sounds like Hannah Montana's scary big sister. But obviously the other impact that I think people don't quite understand or don't think about as much directly with climate change is flooding. Because basically what happens is warmer temperatures leads to more evaporation, which means clouds essentially have more water in them. So when it rains, on average for every degree of warming, you get about 7% more rainfall. We've already warmed by a degree globally. We're on track for potentially 3 degrees. If we do reach that, you're talking about a fifth more water falling. And none of our infrastructure globally, definitely not in this country because it's so old, is designed to deal with that amount of water and rain. So we have a lot of problems coming our way, flash flooding and stuff. And Glasgow, where I'm from, in Scotland, is one of the top cities in Europe at risk from flooding by the middle of this century. So much so that local band Wet, Wet, Wet have decided to add an extra wet to their name, just to make it scientifically accurate. What else should I talk about? Ice at sea. Yeah, so sea level rise is another impact of climate change. So sea level rise occurs, about half of it is from melting of glaciers, ice caps. About 40% of it as well actually comes from thermal expansion. So as water warms, it expands, which you'll see, when your door gets really wet and then you can't open your door when it warms up. Thermal expansion. Basically, if I've ever put on a bit of weight, I just say it's climate change now, given that we're mostly made of water. Ice and sea. I'm going to come back to that in a second, actually. I'm going to go into a bit more detail. Before I get onto this, actually, so why did I do this, right? Why did I go out and talk to people about it? Well, it's difficult, I think, for people to have conversations about climate change in different ways. And I use comedy because I feel that, people have had these lectures and people kind of know some stuff, but it's very difficult to focus. It's very difficult to take it on board and connect with it and all that sort of stuff. And it's difficult for people to have just everyday conversations. I don't know how many conversations you've ever had with your friends and family about climate change. And often people feel it's difficult, when they start talking about climate change to someone, they feel like, it's a bit like talking about your partner's job, right? In the sense that you think you know what you're talking about, and then you have to explain it to someone and you realise you're not entirely sure. Like constantly, people are like, what does your wife do? And I'm like, well, she's on Zoom calls all the time, right? And she says stuff like, we need to start thinking outside the box. I presume she works for the European corrugated board industry. I don't know. So what I do is I try and talk to people. This is nice talking to you guys because, you have influence. You do have a lot more influence than you probably realise. So it's nice to come and do these events. And also, you don't tend to talk back, right? So that's also nice. But, we're going to do some questions, actually, after this as well. But, often talking to family and stuff is quite difficult. I talk to my mum about climate change. You have to talk to people about it on a level that they're already on. You need to you can't just tell people facts and figures and hit them over the head with it. Again, that's why I do this with comedy, because, people are resistant to change, resistant to being told that they should feel bad about it. People shouldn't feel bad about this. So I tried to talk to my mum about it. And I was like, what does my mum like? What is the sort of thing she likes? And I thought, well, she likes celebrities, right? So I said, Mum, one of your favourite celebrities, right, of all time is big into climate change. Ban Ki-moon. Leonardo DiCaprio, I said. Leonardo DiCaprio is big into climate change. He had a film before the flood about climate change. He's got the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation about climate change. He was the UN envoy for peace on climate change. And the reason that he cares about it so much is because the only reason he was famous in the first place was due to an iceberg. So he's very much trying to save those. And obviously he cares about future generations, if you look at who he dates. Anyway, that's a picture of Leo with my favourite UN Secretary General of all time, Ban Ki-moon. There they are. And this is a picture of me at Warrington Bank Station with a cardboard cutout of a moon. There's my head there. Warrington Ban Ki-moon. Yes! The best visual joke about an ex-UN Secretary General you're going to get all afternoon. My wife said, I'm not getting off the train to take that picture for you. You can do it by yourself. And if you miss the train going from London to Glasgow and you're not back on it, that's fine. Well, I think we can all see, from the reaction in the room today, who was right. It's funny, I do that. I mean, it's nice to be around the country. Basically, people around the country generally know where Warrington is, apart from in London. And people are like, but it sounds like a station. Nobody actually knows. Right, excuse me, the next bit. I might have to explain the next bit a little bit, but we'll go into it. So sea level rise. Now, you might not think you know a huge amount about sea level rise, and I will explain to a couple of people in here. I can see some sort of signs of recognition from people of a certain age group. Others, obviously, not entirely sure. I'll explain. These young gentlemen came up with a study back about 22 years ago it was now. They came out with a study about what the sea level rise would be out to the end of the millennium. If you aren't aware, they were a young gentleman called Busted, and they specifically said this in their abstract. They said, I've been to the year 3000, not much has changed, but we lived underwater, and your great-great-great-granddaughter was pretty fine. Okay, shall we take that one bit at a time? Now, first of all, these boys should have been given a Nobel Prize because they were talking about climate change 5 years before An Inconvenient Truth, right? Al Gore got a Nobel Prize. Should never have been awarded. These boys should have got it, right? And firstly, I didn't care about climate change back then. That was over, 2 decades ago. I wasn't interested. All I was interested in back then was getting good grades in my exams at school. Not because I was like a nerd or wanted a good job or anything, but because if I did get good grades, my parents were going to let me and my best friend Colin go to Magaluf for the summer. So now that I've got a PhD, though, I'm able to peer review their comments here, and how likely is this was what I thought I'd look at. Now, this is what the temperature rise will do to central London by I think 2100. This is, but this is basically, firstly, 2 degrees warming. So this is good news. This is what happens if we actually achieve something with climate change. So this is extra. If there's no extra flood prevention put in from today. So basically, there's a lot, billions of pounds that need to be protected, essentially, behind here. And this is the same image under 4 degrees of warming, even higher there. There's probably sharks in the House of Commons, so I guess not much has changed. And this is a bit more of a stark example of what might happen. This is New York. I'm sure many of you will be aware. And you can see, again, another coastal city. There's some flooding there under 2 degrees of warming, again, with no extra flood prevention put in place. And this is the same image under 4 degrees. And according to Busted, they're still under there taking selfies. Everything's absolutely fine. I have an issue with their adaptation assumptions around climate change as well. It's not actually going to be that easy just to go on with our lives. Expected climate displacement around the world is roughly 300 million people on the track that we're on, right, at current trajectories. Put that in context, the Syrian refugee crisis of the last decade, 5 million people globally, right? The scale of what is coming down the road is just so massive that people don't quite understand or don't want to engage with it, and I can understand that. Where are we? So my other issue, I'm trying to remember what my next slide is so I don't give it away. But other issue with their analysis, so first of all was their temperature assumptions, second was their adaptation to climate change assumptions, and third was their life expectancy assumptions. Because I calculated using some ONS statistics what age my great-great-great-granddaughter is likely to be in the year 3000. 786! I don't think she is fine. I think those boys like an older woman. They need to do some more maths homework. That's what I go to school for. Okay, so anyone get that joke? No, it's cool. Basically, to sum up this entire stuff that I've talked about so far, if we do not tackle climate change, the future will be like the film Waterworld. Shit. Okay, so that's the must we change section. How are we doing? Yeah, we're getting on. I'm going to skip through it. Can we do it? Now, we are making progress. So before I get on to wind, solar in the UK, again, basically, energy and power is a starting point. It's been the low-hanging fruit, and it's where we've made a lot of progress over the last decade. And things are genuinely looking up. But the scale of the rate of change is what is so difficult to achieve. And it's possible, but, we're under a bit of time pressure. If we weren't with climate change, if we weren't under a time pressure, I'd be a lot more relaxed, basically. My life would be a lot easier. But we actually do need to achieve this. People are talking about things, do we need to do it by what date? 2050. Basically, the middle of this century, we need to have done pretty much all of the work. And that is ticking away constantly. And I don't think humans are great at thinking exponentially, but that is genuinely how we need to do this. And the changes that will happen to our planet and therefore to impact our societies are going to be exponential, and the changes that need to happen to solve it are going to be exponential in a good way that once things get started, it can sort of tip over and solve. Now, Scotland the UK's gone big on wind. Boris Johnson actually said while he was Prime Minister that he wanted to see the UK be the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. A classic. Which got me thinking, I wonder what Saudi Arabia is the UK of. I don't know, perhaps not drinking. Anyway, but yeah, Scotland has generated enough from wind in 2019 and again in 2022 to power 2 Scotlands. And nobody needs 2 Scotlands. What are we going to do with them? Is one like the nice Scotland that we put out when we've got guests coming round? I mean, that's Edinburgh, isn't it? We are making progress. We are making progress. And the scale of these, I don't think people understand the scale. So this is the largest wind farm in the world is being built in the UK right now. The size of one of these is roughly the same size as the Eiffel Tower. It could potentially power about 6 million homes, just this wind farm. There's going to be 600 of these, and each of these single blades is the same size as 47 Chewbaccas. And he's a big guy, isn't he? He was a big guy. Or if you prefer Imperial. There we go. Star Wars, that's your level, is it? Yes. But yeah, so the UK, we are making progress, but there's a hell of a long way to go because, again, we're starting difficulty. Other things like transport is a big one. I know that's a big one in a lot of industries as well. How do we move things about? Basically, being as efficient as possible is the most important things. The worst thing in the world, in my opinion, are SUVs because they are entirely unnecessary and consume so much more energy than a similar car of a similar size. In fact, globally, so this is the contribution to climate change in the decade 2010 to 2020. So that one decade, I don't know what they're called, but that decade. The largest contribution to climate change was the power sector, predominantly in developing countries that need power for basic things, refrigeration, light, all of those things. So this is predominantly fine, right? The second largest contribution to climate change over that decade was SUVs. Not cars, specifically cars that are too big to park in most normal spaces. Now, the good thing is that we are moving electric, and I think this wasn't even 2022, I got this wrong, is 10% of global sales are now electric. Some countries like Norway, it's up to 80%. We're getting there in the UK, it's beginning to take off, but it is going to change. Basically everything by 2030 is basically beyond that is going to be electric. Now, it's going to be a bit of a change and there will be teething problems to get there, but it will happen, and it's sort of, trying to do that. And so having that in your mind as to, when things are going to change, if that is part of your business and that is something you're going to do, you might not be able to do everything now, but putting in place things further down the line, technology is going to be cheaper, infrastructure is going to be better, and it's absolutely going to happen. Plus, the next Transformers film is just going to be 3 hours of Optimus Prime recharging himself, which is going to be considerably better than any of the previous Transformers films. Now, flying's a difficult one as individuals to do. Again, most transport is basically quite fuel-intensive, especially taking off into the sky. And it's quite difficult. It's quite a difficult one to solve. And most emissions don't come from, certainly in the UK, don't come from business. They don't. And they don't tend to come from people taking their annual holidays. About 70% of emissions come from about 15% of people in the UK. And that's predominantly people flying to the south of France every 2 weeks to their second home and back. That's the main problem that we have. So, we can try and do stuff about that. There's ideas of taxes in place that we can put in place to, if the more flights you take in a year, basically an escalating tax that would sort of mean that flying was more egalitarian, essentially. If that isn't going to work, if that solution isn't going to get in place, I've got another solution, right? Hear me out. Some people are afraid of flying. I think we need to make more people afraid of flying, right? I'm thinking glass floors on planes, actual snakes on a plane. Yeah, the only in-flight entertainment is the film Alive. Yeah, babies crying the entire flight. Every second seat's a baby. How are we getting them to cry? We're blowing smoke in their faces. Solved. Now, food. I'll skip through this quickly because obviously that isn't so relevant to what we're talking about today. But it's quite embarrassing for them coming out with the same earrings on today. So just as an idea of the scale of the problem that we have with food as well. So food obviously requires fertilizers. It also requires land and other things, and there's a whole industry around it. But even without climate change, globally between the year 2000 and 2050, right, we need to produce as much food globally due to population change as has ever been produced in the history of mankind. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that fact for you because that would require more deforestation to grow the sugar. Anyway, but the point is things are changing already because of climate change. So what was already a difficult task, humanity is making so much harder because of our own actions. And because of climate change, for instance, this man's hands have grown so big he can no longer eat foods anymore. No, parrots are migrating and ruining crops. But yeah, food, there are stuff we can do. This is Eat Lancet's planetary diet. Basically, it's what the best diet would be if we thought about, the planet as well as our own health. Turns out it's the Mediterranean diet, the Japanese diet, places that are already incredibly healthy. Those are also the best foods that we should be growing for the planet. So we can move on to that. It is difficult. I've cut down my meat and I've cut down my dairy as well, which is weird. I did start quite early on oat milk. I don't know if anyone else has oat milk a lot. I have it every single morning on my porridge. And I still find it strange after all this time because it's like oats on oat. I feel like the most Scottish man in the entire world. Like, I can't get enough oats. I need someone to ground down more and pour them in my oats for me. Anyway, and homes and buildings obviously are an important part of this, and we do what we can there. Insulation, how we heat things, that sort of thing. And it's difficult. We were making progress in the UK quite well insulating homes until some prime minister or other, I'm not entirely sure, decided to cut funding for home and energy insulation. And these are the sorts of things, just as an idea of this, these are the sorts of things that have to be done centrally. There are problems that we as individuals can solve to some extent, or your business might be able to solve itself. But a lot of the big things need scale. They need people to come together to solve this. This is why associations like this and bodies at scale where you can communicate with each other, where you can, move industries forward, are actually genuinely the most important solutions for climate change, because it won't happen otherwise. And so, this is just an example of what happens if you don't have that centralized control, if we don't work together, essentially, to do stuff, and you look at internal party politics ahead of, the greater good. So I don't know where we're going to get the money to fund all of that. I'm sure there's some money out there somewhere. Not entirely sure. But, we could probably insulate most people's homes. We just need to find the money down the back of the sofa. And then what we need to do with a lot of things, obviously, a lot of places have, say, combined heat and power plants for bigger buildings, for, paper mills, that sort of thing. If it's homes, it's going to be stuff like heat pumps, electric heat pumps that can run off of renewables. Again, Scandinavia's moved ahead. The UK has our houses lose heat 3 times faster than the European average, because our homes are so old and drafty, and we've done nothing about it. Hence why insulating would have been a good idea. That has cost us, that change to that one policy has cost £2.5 billion extra to UK consumers in terms of having to pay energy prices. So again, you have to do things now. You have to make decisions together at scale, but it is actually worth it. It's not some fantasy thing to do. And we need to design buildings better, other things like that. This is the passive house. I don't know if anyone's heard of passive houses. They're a German design, incredibly efficient, so they don't need much cooling or heating at all. Scotland, actually, I think, has just passed a legislation that's going to put that in place for new buildings. So we need to design things better. We need to stop building things on floodplains as well, which the UK seems to still be doing. Now, someone with a lot of time in their hands calculated how many cats you would need to heat a passive house. And I was intrigued. very, and I don't mean like throwing cats on a fire sort of thing. I mean like just the body heats of, of cats. How many cats would you need? And the answer was 18.35 cats. Which, again, I don't know where you're getting 0.35 of a cat. Somebody knows a guy that can get you it, probably. I'm not entirely sure. Also, if you do just go for 19, are you going to overheat your home? That was my main worry. Anyway, regardless, good Instagram content. So, all good. I think that's us pretty much. No, it's been lovely to speak to you, and I'll take some questions now. But, the last part, will we change? Are we going to change? It's very much, there is no answer to that yet. I think people realize that change has to happen, and the solutions are there, but it's very much now about finding, it's about, whether that is at individual levels, whether it's at industry levels, whether it's policy that's required to help industries, to help individuals, all that sort of thing. It's very difficult. And I do this, and I talk to people, and I work in the industry, trying to work on sustainability. And everyone is always pointing the finger at other people. It's always industry saying, well, we need the government to regulate, and the government says we need industry to tell us that we're allowed to regulate them, and individuals are like, well, it's big government's fault, and it's, everybody's always pointing the finger, and I think we need to get beyond that. What we just need to do is come up with understanding what it is we can do, and at what scale is the most effective thing to do. And being part of an industry, you guys are moving forward. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. My first ever work experience, actually, my uncle worked at the Caledonian paper mill in Irvine in Scotland, and that was my first ever work experience when I was I think maybe 13 years old, was in a paper mill. So it's nice to come full circle. But there is, what you do and the industry that you work in is clearly a crucial part of this. And there are things you can and there are things you can't do, and it might be putting pressure on, your suppliers, or it might be, upstream, but it's working together. It's not doing that in a negative way. And I think working at scale, to me, seems like the best way to, you could all be fighting against each other to see who's the most sustainable, to put that on your website. But actually, as an industry, the most effective thing you can do is work together to achieve that, and then beat all the other packaging people. Hopefully. So thank you very much. I think we're going to have questions. Is that the idea? If anyone has any questions, I'm willing to take some. If nobody has, I'll just slink away. Yes, sir, you've got a question. Yeah. Yeah. So what policies are probably likely to come in? I mean, the big one is going to be, and it's tricky because the UK has, obviously we left the European Union, and so we're having to kind of find our own policy landscape just now. But it's very difficult, and I imagine this is the case here, I could be wrong, but because so much business is done with Europe, that you kind of have to follow a similar policy landscape, especially environmentally, if you want to do business. So at the moment, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is going to come in place. So I presume certainly the bigger paper mills and stuff are already under the EU emissions trading scheme, I think. Certainly the bigger ones would be. But I think firstly it's going to be probably steel and to some extent aluminium and some other industries, but I imagine paper is going to be part of that. And it really is, on the one side, you need that policy, you need the pricing stuff, but there's been probably too much reliance from economists and other people who've been a bit too much like, you just put a price on it and it'll sort everything out. It doesn't really, the timing of things don't really work like that. The capital availability to scale up solutions or to at least test stuff in the first instance is also required. So I think it's going to be a combination of the kind of higher level, the top-down level, the UK following European stuff, but at the bottom level, if it actually wants to achieve stuff faster or wants to do things with specific industries, then it's going to be about sort of R&D funding or specific support for things like clusters around the UK. So there's a lot of money potentially going towards clustering businesses together to work off of existing potentially hydrogen networks and stuff like that. So, the UK has got a massive potential, especially given the high level of renewable resources we have. The problem we also have, and I guess I imagine a lot of you would have this as well, is electricity prices in the UK are not. We're just always lagging behind. We're either not protecting industry, we want to be free and not protect industries, but we don't actually support them when they need the support in place. So for me, electricity pricing and potentially, colleagues of mine are doing stuff on specific industries contracting directly with renewables, and I think that does happen, but the sort of scale of that, the scale that could happen at could actually really drive down prices for industry, for electricity. And that's basically most of the, it's larger businesses, certainly, that require a lot of energy. So, I did have a look at some of your statistics, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, I guess a lot of it is coming from, half of it or so is coming from paper, and it's not directly under your control, and there's your own energy, there's the transport, there's what you do in, downstream recycling and all that stuff is fantastic and needs to be continued, but it's the sort of bigger, tougher things. And I would presume that a lot of that heat that is required in those bigger processes, that's the thing that needs to be tackled. And do you do that with renewables? Can you do it with electricity is the question. If you can't do it with electricity because the heat, the actual, the temperature's so high, then you need something else, and it's probably going to be hydrogen. And so it's just putting that direction in place. It needs to be clear from the government for industries that that's the way we're going, and that by these years, this is what's going to happen. Sorry if I went on a bit there, but it was a very good question. Anyone get anything else?
Well, thank you very much.
One more, gentleman. Yeah, of course. The scale that so you're talking about sort of the extra, so if we're all going to get electric cars, it requires even more electricity, is what you're saying? Well, battery recycling, and again, a lot of this is a transition. So I would always advise people to think about this as a transition. This isn't a thing that instantly is going to be perfect overnight. So the steel industry needs to decarbonise, for instance, right? The UK, potentially that's going to happen by 2035. I think it will happen later. I think it will be 2040. We'll see what happens with UK steel. European steel, again, is part of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So there's going to be taxes on if you're not producing lower carbon steel. So the cost of low carbon steel is going to be better. So wind turbines in 15 years' time are going to be made without any carbon. There's no carbon. And you can recycle steel. So wind turbines, I'm not really worried about at all. We will be producing things at a low level. And cars, to some extent, cars have higher steel quality necessities, essentially. So there's more going in there. They're a bit harder to just constantly turn over. But again, you're going to have, not only is the electricity going to be renewable, but you're going to have the actual products, the manufacturing parts are going to be low carbon as well. So and the question about batteries and stuff, again, it is a transition. So it is happening. People are working out, how do you reuse these? How do we take these apart? And that has to happen. There has to be a move towards a much more sustainable way of reusing those. But even at present, the emissions associated with everything, so the whole life cycle of an electric vehicle, the emissions are a quarter of a standard, the same size of petrol and diesel car. So you take all of that into consideration, and that's only going to decrease. So as our electricity system, the amount of renewables goes in, it decreases. Same with the steel in the car. So again, it is a transition, but even things like electric vehicles, we're already and it's not perfect, but they're already four. You could all have 4 electric vehicles for owning one car and feel the same in terms of climate change. I know that's not a good way of thinking about it necessarily, but it gives a bit of context. But it's not going to be a perfect transition. There's going to be mistakes made, and we have to be aware of what those mistakes might be and lock into certain things that might not be helpful or producing too much or that sort of thing. So it is a tricky one, and I think it's always good to have those elements of wider sustainability and stuff in your head as well. Any other specific questions? No?
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.